Trusting frowned, glancing up at the ruddy midday sky as his servants scuttled forward, opening a parasol over Trusting and his distinguished guest. Ashfalls weren't that uncommon in the Final Empire, but Trusting had hoped to avoid getting soot stains on his fine new suit coat and red vest, which had just arrived via canal boat from Luthadel itself. Fortunately, there wasn't much wind. The parasol would likely be effective. Trusting stood with his guest on a small hilltop patio that overlooked the fields. Hundreds of people in brown smocks worked in the falling ash, caring for the crops. There was a sluggishness to their efforts, but of course that was the way of the Ska. The peasants were an indolent, unproductive lot. They didn't complain, of course. They knew better than that. Instead, they simply worked with bowed heads, moving about their work with quiet apathy. The passing whip of a taskmaster would force them into dedicated motion for a few moments, but as soon as the taskmaster passed, they would return to their languor. Trusting turned to the man standing beside him on the hill. "One would think," Trusting noted, "that 1,000 years of working in fields would have bred them to be a little more effective at it." The obligator turned, raising an eyebrow, the motion done as if to highlight his most distinctive feature, the intricate tattoos that laced the skin around his eyes. The tattoos were enormous, reaching all the way across his brow and up the sides of his nose. This was a full prelin, a very important obligator indeed. Trusting had his own personal obligators back at the manor, but they were only minor functionaries with barely a few marks around their eyes. This man had arrived from Luthadel with the same canal boat that had brought Trusting's new suit. "You should see City Ska, Trusting," the obligator said, turning back to watch the Ska workers. "These are actually quite diligent, compared to those inside Luthadel. You have more direct control over your Ska here. How many would you say you lose a month?" "Oh, 6 or so," Trusting said. "Some to beatings, some to exhaustion." "Runaways?" "Never," Trusting said. "When I first inherited this land from my father, I had a few runaways, but I executed their families. The rest quickly lost heart. I've never understood men who have trouble with their Ska. I find the creatures easy to control, if you show a properly firm hand." The obligator nodded, standing quietly in his gray robes. He seemed pleased, which was a good thing. The Ska weren't actually Trusting's property. Like all Ska, they belonged to the Lord Ruler. Trusting only leased the workers from his god, much in the same way he paid for the services of his obligators. The obligator looked down, checking his pocket watch, then glanced up at the sun. Despite the ashfall, the sun was bright this day, shining a brilliant crimson red behind the smoky blackness of the upper sky. Trusting removed a handkerchief and wiped his brow, thankful for the parasol's shade against the midday heat. "Very well, Trusting," the obligator said. "I will carry your proposal to Lord Venture as requested. He will have a favorable report from me on your operations here." Trusting held in a sigh of relief. An obligator was required to witness any contract or business deal between noblemen. True, even a lowly obligator like the ones Trusting employed could serve as such a witness, but it meant so much more to impress Straff Venture's own obligator. The obligator turned toward him. "I will leave back down the canal this afternoon." "So soon?" Trusting asked. "Wouldn't you care to stay for supper?" "No," the obligator replied. "Though there is another matter I wish to discuss with you. I came not only at the behest of Lord Venture, but to look in on some matters for the Canton of Inquisition. Rumors say that you like to dally with your Ska women." Trusting felt a chill. The obligator smiled. He likely meant it to be disarming, but Trusting only found it eerie. "Don't worry yourself, Trusting," the obligator said. "If there had been any real worries about your actions, a Steel Inquisitor would have been sent here in my place." Trusting nodded slowly. Inquisitor. He'd never seen one of the inhuman creatures, but he had heard stories. I have been satisfied regarding your actions with the Ska women, the obligator said, looking back over the fields. What I've seen and heard here indicate that you always clean up your messes. A man such as yourself, efficient, productive, could go far in Luthadel. A few more years of work, some inspired mercantile deals, and who knows? The obligator turned away, and Trusting found himself smiling. It wasn't a promise or even an endorsement. For the most part, obligators were more bureaucrats and witnesses than they were priests. But to hear such praise from one of the Lord Ruler's own servants... Trusting knew that some nobility considered the obligators to be unsettling. Some men even considered them a bother. But at that moment, Trusting could have kissed his distinguished guest. Trusting turned back toward the Ska, who worked quietly beneath the bloody sun and the lazy flakes of ash. Trusting had always been a country nobleman, living on his plantation, dreaming of perhaps moving into Luthadel itself. He had heard of the balls and the parties, the glamour and the intrigue, and it excited him to no end. I'll have to celebrate tonight, he thought. There was that young girl in the 14th hovel that he'd been watching for some time. He smiled again. A few more years of work, the obligator had said. But could Trusting perhaps speed that up if he worked a little harder? His Ska population had been growing lately. Perhaps if he pushed them a bit more, he could bring in an extra harvest this summer and fulfill his contract with Lord Venture in extra measure. Trusting nodded as he watched the crowd of lazy Ska, some working with their hoes, others on hands and knees pushing the ash away from the fledgling crops. They didn't complain, they didn't hope, they barely dared think. That was the way it should be, for they were Ska. They were... Trusting froze as one of the Ska looked up. The man met Trusting's eyes, a spark, no, a fire of defiance showing in his expression. Trusting had never seen anything like it, not on the face of a Ska. Trusting stepped backward reflexively, a chill running through him as the strange, straight-backed Ska held his eyes. And smiled. Trusting looked away. "Curtin!" he snapped. The burly taskmaster rushed up the incline. "Yes, my lord." Trusting turned, pointing at... He frowned. Where had that Ska been standing? Working with their heads bowed, bodies stained by soot and sweat, they were so hard to tell apart. Trusting paused, searching. He thought he knew the place. An empty spot where nobody now stood. But no, that couldn't be it. The man couldn't have disappeared from the group so quickly. Where would he have gone? He must be in there somewhere, working with his head now properly bowed. Still, his moment of apparent defiance was inexcusable. "My lord?" Curtin asked again. The obligator stood at the side, watching curiously. It would not be wise to let the man know that one of the Ska had acted so brazenly. "Work the Ska in that southern section a little harder," Trusting ordered, pointing. "I see them being sluggish, even for Ska. Beat a few of them." Curtin shrugged, but nodded. It wasn't much of a reason for a beating, but then he didn't need much of a reason to give the workers a beating. They were, after all, only Ska. Kelsier had heard stories. He had heard whispers of times when once, long ago, the sun had not been red. Times when the sky hadn't been clogged by smoke and ash, when plants hadn't struggled to grow, and when Ska hadn't been slaves. Times before the Lord Ruler. Those days, however, were nearly forgotten. Even the legends were growing vague. Kelsier watched the sun, his eyes following the giant red disk as it crept toward the western horizon. He stood quietly for a long moment, alone in the empty fields. The day's work was done. The sky had been herded back to their hovels. Soon the mists would come. Eventually, Kelsier sighed, then turned to pick his way across the furrows and pathways, weaving between large heaps of ash. He avoided stepping on the plants, though he wasn't sure why he bothered. The crops hardly seemed worth the effort. Wan, with wilted brown leaves, the plants seemed as depressed as the people who tended them. The sky hovels loomed in the waning light. Already Kelsier could see the mists beginning to form, clouding the air and giving the mound-like buildings a surreal, intangible look. The hovels stood unguarded. There was no need for watchers, for no ska would venture outside once night arrived. Their fear of the mists was far too strong. "I'll have to cure them of that someday," Kelsier thought as he approached one of the larger buildings. But all things in their own time. He pulled open the door and slipped inside. Conversation stopped immediately. Kelsier closed the door, then turned with a smile to confront the room of about 30 ska. A fire pit burned weakly at the center, and the large cauldron beside it was filled with a vegetable-dappled water, the beginnings of an evening meal. The soup would be bland, of course. Still, the smell was enticing. "Good evening, everyone," Kelsier said with a smile, resting his pack beside his feet and leaning against the door. "How was your day?" His words broke the silence, and the women returned to their dinner preparations. A group of men, sitting at a crude table, however, continued to regard Kelsier with dissatisfied expressions. "Our day was filled with work, traveler," said Tepper, one of the ska elders. "Something you managed to avoid." "Field work hasn't ever really suited me," Kelsier said. "It's far too hard on my delicate skin." He smiled, holding up hands and arms that were lined with layers and layers of thin scars. They covered his skin, running lengthwise, as if some beast had repeatedly raked its claws up and down his arms. Tepper snorted. He was young to be an elder, probably barely into his 40s. At most, he might be 5 years Kelsier's senior. However, the scrawny man held himself with the air of one who liked to be in charge. "This is no time for levity," Tepper said sternly. "When we harbor a traveler, we expect him to behave himself and avoid suspicion. When you ducked away from the fields this morning, you could have earned a whipping for the men around you." "True," Kelsier said. "But those men could also have been whipped for standing in the wrong place, for pausing too long, or for coughing when a taskmaster walked by. I once saw a man beaten because his master claimed that he had blinked inappropriately." Tepper sat with narrow eyes and a stiff posture, his arm resting on the table. His expression was unyielding. Kelsier sighed, rolling his eyes. "Fine, if you want me to go, I'll be off then." He slung his pack up on his shoulder and nonchalantly pulled open the door. Thick mist immediately began to pour through the portal, drifting lazily across Kelsier's body, pooling on the floor and creeping across the dirt like a hesitant animal. Several people gasped in horror, though most of them were too stunned to make a sound. Kelsier stood for a moment, staring out into the dark mists, their shifting currents lit feebly by the cooking pit's coals. "Close the door." Tepper's words were a plea, not a command. Kelsier did as requested, pushing the door closed and stemming the flood of white mist. "The mist is not what you think. You fear it far too much." "Men who venture into the mist lose their souls," a woman whispered. Her words raised a question. Had Kelsier walked in the mists? What then happened to his soul? If you only knew, Kelsier thought. "Well, I guess this means I'm staying." He waved for a boy to bring him a stool. It's a good thing, too. It would have been a shame for me to leave before I shared my news." More than one person perked up at the comment. This was the real reason they tolerated him, the reason even the timid peasants would harbor a man such as Kelsier, a Ska who defied the Lord Ruler's will by traveling from plantation to plantation. A renegade he might be, a danger to the entire community, but he brought news from the outside world. "I come from the north," Kelsier said, "from lands where the Lord Ruler's touch is less noticeable." He spoke in a clear voice, and people leaned unconsciously toward him as they worked. On the next day, Kelsier's words would be repeated to the several hundred people who lived in other hovels. The Ska might be subservient, but they were incurable gossips. "Local lords rule in the west," Kelsier said, "and they are far from the iron grip of the Lord Ruler and his obligators. Some of these distant noblemen are finding that happy Ska make better workers than mistreated Ska. One man, Lord Renew, has even ordered his taskmasters to stop unauthorized beatings. There are whispers that he's considering paying wages to his plantation Ska, like city craftsmen might earn." "Nonsense," Tepper said. "My apologies," Kelsier said. "I didn't realize that Goodman Tepper had been to Lord Renew's estates recently. When you dined with him last, did he tell you something that he did not tell me?" Tepper blushed. Ska did not travel, and they certainly didn't dine with lords. "You think me a fool, traveler," Tepper said, "but I know what you're doing. You're the one they call the survivor. Those scars on your arms give you away. You're a troublemaker. You travel the plantations, stirring up discontent. You eat our food, telling your grand stories and your lies, then you disappear and leave people like me to deal with the false hopes you give our children." Kelsier raised an eyebrow. Now, Goodman Tepper," he said. "Your worries are completely unfounded. Why, I have no intention of eating your food. I brought my own." With that, Kelsier reached over and tossed his pack onto the earth before Tepper's table. The loose bag slumped to the side, dumping an array of foods to the ground. Fine breads, fruits, and even a few thick-cured sausages bounced free. A summer fruit rolled across the packed earthen floor and bumped lightly against Tepper's foot. The middle-aged Ska regarded the fruit with stunned eyes. "That's nobleman's food," Kelsier snorted. "Barely. You know, for a man of renowned prestige and rank, your Lord Tresting has remarkably poor taste. His pantry is an embarrassment to his noble station." Tepper paled even further. "That's where you went this afternoon," he whispered. "You went to the manor. You stole from the master." "Indeed," Kelsier said. "And might I add that while your lord's taste in food is deplorable, his eye for soldiers is far more impressive. Sneaking into his manor during the day was quite a challenge." Tepper was still staring at the bag of food. "If the taskmasters find this here—" "Well, I suggest you make it disappear, then," Kelsier said. "I'd be willing to bet that it tastes a fair bit better than watered-down farlet soup." 24 sets of hungry eyes studied the food. If Tepper intended further arguments, he didn't make them quickly enough, for his silent pause was taken as agreement. Within a few minutes, the bag's contents had been inspected and distributed, and the pot of soup sat bubbling and ignored as the Ska feasted on a meal far more exotic. Kelsier sat back, leaning against the hovel's wooden wall, and watching the people devour their food. He had spoken correctly. The pantry's offerings had been depressingly mundane. However, this was a people who had been fed on nothing but soup and gruel since they were children. To them, breads and fruits were rare delicacies, usually eaten only as aging discards brought down by the house servants. "Your storytelling was cut short, young man," an elderly Ska noted, hobbling over to sit on a stool beside Kelsier. "Oh, I suspect there will be time for more later," Kelsier said. "Once all evidence of my thievery has been properly devoured. Don't you want any of it?"
"No, indeed," the old man said. "The last time I tried Lord's food, I had stomach pains for 3 days. New tastes are like new ideas, young man. The older you get, the more difficult they are for you to stomach."
Kelsier paused. The old man was hardly an imposing sight. His leathered skin and bald scalp made him look more frail than they did wise. Yet he had to be stronger than he looked. Few plantation skaa lived to such ages. Many lords didn't allow the elderly to remain home from daily work, and the frequent beatings that made up a skaa's life took a terrible toll on the elderly. "What was your name again?" Kelsier asked.
"Menace."
Kelsier glanced back at Tepper.
"So, Goodman Menace, tell me something. Why do you let him lead?"
Menace shrugged.
"When you get to be my age, you have to be very careful where you waste your energy. Some battles just aren't worth fighting."
There was an implication in Menace's eyes. He was referring to things greater than his own struggle with Tepper. "You're satisfied with this, then?" Kelsier asked, nodding toward the hovel and its half-starved, overworked occupants. "You're content with a life full of beatings and endless drudgery?"
"At least it's a life," Menace said. "I know what wages malcontent and rebellion bring. The eye of the Lord Ruler and the ire of the Steel Ministry can be far more terrible than a few whippings. Men like you preach change, but I wonder, is this a battle we can really fight?"
"You're fighting it already, Goodman Menace. You're just losing horribly." Kelsier shrugged. "But what do I know? I'm just a traveling miscreant, here to eat your food and impress your youths." Menace shook his head.
"You jest, but Tepper might have been right. I fear your visit will bring us grief."
Kelsier smiled. "That's why I didn't contradict him. At least, not on the troublemaker point." He paused, then smiled more deeply. "In fact, I'd say calling me a troublemaker is probably the only accurate thing Tepper has said since I got here."
"How do you do that?" Menace asked, frowning.
"What?"
"Smile so much."
"Oh, I'm just a happy person." Menace glanced down at Kelsier's hands.
"You know, I've only seen scars like those on one other person, and he was dead. His body was returned to Lord Tristing as proof that his punishment had been carried out."
Menace looked up at Kelsier.
"He'd been caught speaking of rebellion. Tristing sent him to the pits of Hathsin, where he was worked until he died. The lad lasted less than a month."
Kelsier glanced down at his hands and forearms. They still burned sometimes, though he was certain the pain was only in his mind. He looked up at Menace and smiled. "You ask why I smile, Goodman Menace? Well, the Lord Ruler thinks he has claimed laughter and joy for himself. I'm disinclined to let him do so. This is one battle that doesn't take very much effort to fight." Menace stared at Kelsier, and for a moment Kelsier thought the old man might smile in return. However, Menace eventually just shook his head.
"I don't know. I just don't—"
The scream cut him off. It came from outside, perhaps to the north, though the mists distorted sounds. The people in the hovel fell silent, listening to the faint, high-pitched yells. Despite the distance and the mist, Kelsier could hear the pain contained in those screams. Kelsier burned tin. It was simple for him now, after years of practice. The tin sat with other allomantic metals within his stomach, swallowed earlier, waiting for him to draw upon them. He reached inside with his mind and touched the tin, tapping powers he still barely understood. The tin flared to life within him, burning his stomach like the sensation of a hot drink swallowed too quickly. Allomantic power surged through his body, enhancing his senses. The room around him became crisp, the dull fire pit flaring to near blinding brightness. He could feel the grain in the wood of the stool beneath him. He could still taste the remnants of the loaf of bread he'd snacked on earlier. Most importantly, he could hear the screams with supernatural ears. Two separate people were yelling. One was an older woman, the other a younger woman, perhaps a child. The younger screams were getting farther and farther away.
"Poor Jess,"
a nearby woman said, her voice booming in Kelsier's enhanced ears.
"That child of hers was a curse. It's better for Ska not to have pretty daughters."
Tepper nodded.
"Lord Tresting was sure to send for the girl sooner or later. We all knew it. Jess knew it."
"Still a shame, though," another man said. The screams continued in the distance. Burning tin, Kelsier was able to judge the direction accurately. Her voice was moving toward the Lord's manor. The sounds set something off within him, and he felt his face flush with anger. Kelsier turned. "Does Lord Tresting ever return the girls after he's finished with them?" Old Menace shook his head.
"Lord Tresting is a law-abiding nobleman. He has the girls killed after a few weeks. He doesn't want to catch the eye of the Inquisitors."
That was the Lord Ruler's command. He couldn't afford to have half-breed children running around, children who might possess powers that Ska weren't even supposed to know existed. The screams waned, but Kelsier's anger only built. The yells reminded him of other screams, a woman's screams from the past. He stood abruptly, stool toppling to the ground behind him.
"Careful, lad,"
Menace said apprehensively.
"Remember what I said about wasting energy? You'll never raise that rebellion of yours if you get yourself killed tonight."
Kelsier glanced toward the old man. Then, through the screams and the pain, he forced himself to smile. "I'm not here to lead a rebellion among you, Goodman Menace. I just want to stir up a little trouble."
"What good could that do?"
Kelsier's smile deepened. "New days are coming. Survive a little longer, and you just might see great happenings in the Final Empire. I bid you all thanks for your hospitality." With that, he pulled open the door and strode out into the mist. Menace lay awake in the early hours of morning. It seemed that the older he became, the more difficult it was for him to sleep. This was particularly true when he was troubled about something, such as the traveler's failure to return to the hovel. Menace hoped that Kelsier had come to his senses and decided to move on. However, that prospect seemed unlikely. Menace had seen the fire in Kelsier's eyes. It seemed such a shame that a man who had survived the pits would instead find death here, on a random plantation trying to protect a girl everyone else had given up for dead. How would Lord Tresting react? He was said to be particularly harsh with anyone who interrupted his nighttime enjoyments. If Kelsier had managed to disturb the master's pleasures, Tresting might easily decide to punish the rest of his Ska by association. Eventually, the other Ska began to awake. Menace lay on the hard earth, bones aching, back complaining, muscles exhausted, trying to decide if it was worth rising. Each day he nearly gave up. Each day it was a little harder. One day he would just stay in the hovel, waiting until the taskmasters came to kill those who were too sick or too elderly to work. But not today. He could see too much fear in the eyes of the Ska. They knew that Kelsier's nighttime activities would bring trouble. They needed Menace. They looked to him. He needed to get up. And so he did. Once he started moving, the pains of age decreased slightly, and he was able to shuffle out of the hovel toward the fields, leaning on a younger man for support. It was then that he caught a scent in the air.
"What's that?"
he asked.
"Do you smell smoke?"
Shum, the lad upon whom Menace leaned, paused. The last remnants of the night's mist had burned away, and the red sun was rising behind the sky's usual haze of blackish clouds.
"I always smell smoke lately," Shum said. "The ash mounts are violent this year."
"No," Menace said, feeling increasingly apprehensive.
"This is different."
He turned to the north, toward where a group of Ska were gathering. He let go Shum, shuffling toward the group, feet kicking up dust and ash as he moved. At the center of the group of people, he found Jess. Her daughter, the one they all assumed had been taken by Lord Tresting, stood beside her. The young girl's eyes were red from lack of sleep, but she appeared unharmed.
"She came back not long after they took her," the woman was explaining. "She came and pounded on the door, crying in the mist. Flynn was sure it was just a mist wraith impersonating her, but I had to let her in. I don't care what he says, I'm not giving her up. I brought her out in the sunlight and she didn't disappear. That proves she's not a mist wraith."
Menace stumbled back from the growing crowd. Did none of them see it? No taskmasters came to break up the group. No soldiers came to make the morning population counts. Something was very wrong. Menace continued to the north, moving frantically toward the manor house. By the time he arrived, others had noticed the twisting line of smoke that was just barely visible in the morning light. Menace wasn't the first to arrive at the edge of the short hilltop plateau, but the group made way for him when he did. The manor house was gone. Only a blackened, smoldering scar remained.
"By the Lord Ruler," Menace whispered. "What happened here?" "He killed them all."
Menace turned. The speaker was Jess's girl. She stood looking down at the fallen house, a satisfied expression on her youthful face.
"They were dead when he brought me out," she said. "All of them. The soldiers, the taskmasters, the lords. Dead. Even Lord Tresting and his obligators. The master had left me, going to investigate when the noises began. On the way out I saw him lying in his own blood. Stab wounds in his chest. The man who saved me threw a torch in the building as we left." "This man," Menace said. "He had scars on his hands and arms reaching past the elbows?"
The girl nodded silently.
"What kind of demon was that man?" one of the Ska muttered uncomfortably.
"Mist wraith," another whispered, apparently forgetting that Kelsier had gone out during the day.
But he did go out into the mist, Menace thought. And how did he accomplish a feat like this? Lord Tresting kept over 24 soldiers. Did Kelsier have a hidden band of rebels, perhaps?
Kelsier's words from the night before sounded in his ears. New days are coming.
"But what of us?" Tepper asked, terrified. "What will happen when the Lord Ruler hears this? He'll think that we did it. He'll send us to the pits, or maybe just send his Kolos to slaughter us outright. Why would that troublemaker do something like this? Doesn't he understand the damage he's done?" "He understands," Menace said. "He warned us, Tepper. He came to stir up trouble." "But why?" "Because he knew we'd never rebel on our own, so he gave us no choice."
Tepper paled. Lord Ruler, Menace thought.
"I can't do this. I can barely get up in the mornings. I can't save this people."
But what other choice was there? Menace turned.
"Gather the people, Tepper. We must flee before word of this disaster reaches the Lord Ruler." "Where will we go?" "The caves to the east," Menace said. "Travelers say there are rebel Ska hiding in them. Perhaps they'll take us in."
Tepper paled further.
"But we'd have to travel for days, spend nights in the mist." "We can do that," Menace said, "or we can stay here and die."
Tepper stood frozen for a moment, and Menace thought the shock of it all might have overwhelmed him. Eventually, however, the younger man scurried off to gather the others as commanded. Menace sighed, looking up toward the trailing line of smoke, cursing the man Kelsier quietly in his mind. New days indeed. Part 1. The Survivor of Hath-Sin. I consider myself to be a man of principle, but what man does not? Even the cutthroat, I have noticed, considers his actions moral after a fashion. Perhaps another person, reading of my life, would name me a religious tyrant. He could call me arrogant. What is to make that man's opinion any less valid than my own? I guess it all comes down to one fact. In the end, I'm the one with the armies. 1. Ash fell from the sky. Vin watched the downy flakes drift through the air. Leisurely, careless, free. The puffs of soot fell like black snowflakes, descending upon the dark city of Luthadel. They drifted in corners, blowing in the breeze and curling in tiny whirlwinds over the cobblestones. They seemed so uncaring. What would that be like? Vin sat quietly in one of the crew's watch holes, a hidden alcove built into the bricks on the side of the safe house. From within it, a crew member could watch the street for signs of danger. Vin wasn't on duty. The watch hole was simply one of the few places where she could find solitude. And Vin liked solitude. When you're alone, no one can betray you. Reen's words. Her brother had taught her so many things, then had reinforced them by doing what he'd always promised he would,